Hello there once again. Welcome to another episode of A Swift Half with Snowdon with me, Christopher Snowdon. I hope you're well. Had a good couple of weeks since the last episode. I'm very pleased to introduce a very special guest. We wanted to get him on the show since we started doing this. He is the Angry Chef. He's Anthony Warner. Anthony, how's it going?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Now, you're not all that angry, are you, when it comes down to it?
No. No. I mean, I often say this. People are often sometimes a bit disappointed when they meet me or they hear me speak. I did. The Angry Chef was a character I created, I think, more than anything, to kind of get some to talk about some stuff. I am a chef. I will say that, but perhaps I'm not quite as angry in person as I am in my writing. At least, I'm not going to be shouting and swearing too much.
So you started off that persona with the blog, which was mainly about sort of nutritional quacks and fad diets and people like, well, we might as well name names, Gillian McKeith.
Yeah.
Ivor Cummings, was he on the radar at the time?
It came up a little bit later on. I think the initial blog was sort of dealing with a lot of the sort of clean eating, like the Hemsey sister and Delicious Yellow and people like that. But it did sort of spiral from there. I found, I entered a world of sort of low carb quackery with the likes of Cummins and Malhotra, who you're well aware of. Those people just sort of came on my radar as I started writing about food. So I was just interested in people talking about food who are getting stuff wrong, sort of getting the science of food and the science of nutrition wrong, and trying to understand some of the reasons why they kept on getting it wrong and why these mistakes were so compelling and so easy to sort of monetize and create great businesses out of, which is what a lot of these people have done.
They really do. And I sort of got drawn into writing about them as well, even though I really don't care at all about what diets people are on. I'm not even that bothered if people are making money out of selling diet books particularly, but I'm interested in the policy of it, and I don't want food treated like tobacco. That's my kind of red line. And so everything I write is about, policies, what I think are bad policies, counterproductive policies. And how I got drawn into the low carb thing, I'm not too sure. Asim Malhotra came across my radar, I think, from his very first article in The Observer, which was just littered with mistakes. And I thought, who is this guy? And I think I wrote a blog, in a similar kind of style to one of yours, really, sort of fisking it. And I guess then the low carb thing very quickly turned into a sort of fanatical anti-sugar thing. And again, Malhotra was at the forefront of that with action on sugar. And there seems to be, I suppose, a fairly obvious link between being anti-carb and being anti-one specific kind of carb. And then anti-sugar has now been the big policy thing of the last 6 or 7 years. And that's what's got me interested with the sugar tax and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But there is a connection between that kind of thing and being wrong about COVID, right? Like colossally wrong about COVID, because Cummings obviously has come to more widespread attention now because he's become one of the main sort of COVID deniers, whatever you want to call it. But also Gillian McKeith is in that camp. Zoe Harcum is in that camp. Tim Noakes in South Africa. There's probably quite a few more because I don't know that many of these people, but they tend towards being pretty skeptical about the vaccines, pretty keen on things like ivermectin. And I do not see what the connection is, other than they're just anti-scientific and playing to a certain crowd. I don't see it's not obvious to me why there should be this transition from being in favor of a low carb diet and being anti-COVID vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this quite a lot, and I think there is a sort of pathway that takes them from one to the other, and it's really this idea that so much of these sort of health influencers and diet people are always like, your health is in your hands. You can take control of your health. You just follow my diet and you can achieve perfect health. And if you're ill, there's kind of a blame culture around any sort of chronic illness. And that's for me is where it comes from, because a big pandemic comes along and you suddenly realize that actually your health isn't in your hands. And and so you sort of, these people, their business model kind of falls apart in that scenario. For them, they must say, well, you can take charge of your health. And there was this big thing about, if you eat right, if you're the right weight or whatever, you won't get COVID. based on some, very sort of tenuous connections. And there was a lot of stuff about boosting immune system through diet. And if you had a proper
the 21-day immunity plan.
Yeah, which was, Malhotra rehashed his old work into a little sort of pamphlet, which he sold in the middle of a pandemic, telling people that this book was the best vaccine for coronavirus, which is horrendously exploitative. But it's also this narrative of taking charge of your own health is very important in those communities. And that a virus which is pretty indiscriminate, it just mortality based mostly on age, that's really not doesn't fit into that, and then they really struggled, and so they had to sort of latch onto this stuff, and then the vaccine, if that's the best thing for your health, then it sort of, again, it pulls apart their sort of their business model, essentially, because they're all about taking charge of your own health. So don't take this vaccine because it's, and then there's tendencies to conspiracy theory as well, and the big pharma and the big companies are exploiting us, and so the pandemic really troubled a lot of these people, and they went down that path. They went down that path of conspiracy theory. They went down that path of, we're being manipulated and the truth's being hidden from you, and if you're all just healthy and ate real food and weren't sort of irresponsible with your health, then you'd all be fine, which is obviously wrong, but also incredibly dangerous and incredibly upsetting for people who've been hit and affected by this virus, which is, there are correlations between various things, but it does also kill indiscriminately. It's a horrible thing, and to be telling people that if they'd only taken charge of their immunity and had only followed my 21-day immune system boosting diet, you'd be fine. That's pretty offensive and pretty upsetting. And the upsetting thing is that for years we as in the community, people who write about these things and have been saying this. I've been saying, if you reject evidence and you reject science and you go down this path, this is where you'll end up. You'll end up in vaccine denial. You'll end up, people, with these ridiculous, dangerous, really unpleasant sort of narratives about taking charge of your own health and it's your fault if you get ill. But when it was just a low carb diet, it didn't seem that important. But when it's like a pandemic disease, it takes a different, it is a very different perspective you have to take. And I think some of what I've seen is really offensive and really unpleasant and unforgivable, really.
Yeah, and dangerous too. And they take a certain glee in the fact that obese people are more likely to die from COVID. I saw a quite ridiculous thing the other day on Twitter, been retweeted hundreds of times as usual. It was a map of excess mortality during the course of the pandemic. Do you see this? And then a map of obesity rates around the world. Well, actually, I think it was a map of obesity-related deaths, actually.
Right.
And it was supposed to be this incredibly obvious, comparison, and there wasn't. It was like Russia had quite a high rate of excess mortality, and apparently has quite a high rate of obesity.
They're ignoring New Zealand and Australia as well.
No, New Zealand was, they had New Zealand as being quite low on obesity. I think it was a bit of a dodgy graph, to be honest, because I don't think Russia does have a particularly high rate of obesity-related deaths. And I would imagine Australia does, because it has a high rate of obesity. But this was meant to be the message. And the people who kind of denying the vaccines and denying that COVID is really a problem are happy to say, well, this is basically a lifestyle thing. It's basically about obesity. And to some extent, the government's done the same thing by
that's what I was
scapegoating obesity.
It's not just those sort of health influencers who jumped on that sort of correlation. It's a lot of sort of government bodies and public health bodies and World Public Health bodies said, there's this correlation between countries where, with high rates of obesity and high rates of COVID deaths, and so and that's just a ridiculous thing to say. Without sort of the obvious big correlation is age. Age is the big thing. Type 2 diabetes seems to have an effect.
Well, the big correlation is not having the virus around, right?
Yeah.
China's got quite a low rate. A lot of people live in China.
Yeah, I mean, not being vaccinated is the other.
That too, you're right. Yeah.
Big thing,
yeah.
But those things don't fall. So these people who are desperate because this pandemic had kind of undermined what they've been saying for such a long time, they latched onto those things about obesity in quite an unpleasant and offensive way. And we got back to this sort of blaming, saying the NHS is being overwhelmed by obese people, which is that sort of constant message we've been heard for years and years and years, and what most of my second book was about, really trying to push against that message, because it's really unpleasant and it's really offensive, and it's, you know, really horrible things to be saying about people, especially when it's just not true.
Right, it's not really true, is it?
No. You know, there's a correlation, you know, but that's, you know, between COVID deaths and obesity, that seems to be mostly due to sort of type 2 diabetes and various other health conditions. But, you know, this idea that somehow body fat is making you more likely to get a virus, well, that makes no sense.
Do people think that? They think it makes you more likely to get the virus in the first place?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have seen that, you know, I mean, but it just is generally, you know, it's generally this sort of association with being irresponsible and being a bad person and you know, an easy target to blame. It's really easy to blame obesity when we have any of these sort of issues with any of these big complex things, like a virus which is, you know, difficult to understand how it's changing the world. We look for someone to blame. We look for someone to force the blame onto, and obesity and obese people were that target for a lot of these health influencers, but also, as you said, for governments and for public health bodies.
Yeah, people in public health, exactly. Well, you could tell from the early days of the pandemic, they were desperate to try and tie this really serious, you know, problem of infectious disease to something they were familiar with, and they couldn't do it. There didn't seem to be any link with alcohol. The link with smoking was inverted, if anything. But then we got this evidence on obesity, and of course there is this, there is definitely an association, particularly with people who are morbidly obese. But people will go around saying 70% of people in hospital with COVID are overweight. So, well, there's like 64% of the population are overweight. That's not a particularly striking correlation, really.
No, it's very easy to make those, you know, it's very easy to manipulate that and to just to put blame back onto people rather than to, you know, the real things real really terrible things which did happen during the pandemic. You know, it was managed really badly in many ways, but, you know, if we're blaming just people for their weight, that's you know, kind of absolves these bodies from responsibility, doesn't it?
Yeah, and let's talk a bit about your second book, The Truth About Fat, because it's a really fascinating book. I recommend it to a lot of people because, I mean, you don't really come up with the answer. And I guess the big selling point with any book about obesity has to be you found the key to it. But the weird thing about obesity, considering how studied it's been for years and years, is we still don't really know, do we, what the cause is of the rise since 1980s. You make a very interesting point in the book, saying actually this is not a sudden thing that's happened since about 1980. It's actually more gradual. Can you just explain that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, obesity is measured in a slightly unusual way, really. I mean, you might have a different opinion on this, but for me, it's because obesity is when people cross a certain threshold of BMI. You know, so this point they're not obese, this point they are obese. So if you get to above 30 BMI of 30, then suddenly you're obese. And you know, if you think about the way that you know, general body weight changes over time, it kind of changes gradually, and you know, there's a sort of a bell curve, and it moves slowly in one direction as populations get better fed. You know, as people have more availability of food. You know, go back 150 years, then obviously in countries like the UK, there are a lot of people who really didn't have very much food, and the food supply has improved dramatically over time and improved a lot, you know, throughout the 20th century, certainly. And you know, when you have more access to food, when fewer people are going hungry, yes, the average, you know, BMI increases in the population, and that curve sort of moves that way. And if you suddenly take a cutoff of 30 as being, you know, and the number of people over that cutoff as being the measure that we all live by, rather than what's the average BMI, then you do get this effect that sort of steep side of the curve starts cutting through, and you get more and more people. In 1980, the curve just happens to sort of, you get more and more people crossing that sort of 30 threshold. And you know, the reason why it happens in 1980 is because the BMI for obesity was set at 30 by the World Health Organization because it was a nice round number. If it had been 32, it would have been, a few years later. If it had been 28, it would have been a few years before. So people have been looking for this, what happened in 1980 or the late 70s or whatever, what was the big change? Whereas the reality is, if you look at average BMI over time, you sort of break it down in that way, it's a pretty steady increase from, the 1880s through to sort of the end of the 20th century. Just like every year, BMI tends to go increase a little bit. And I think the main reason for that is just because, our food supply is better. We have more calories available per person. There's probably sort of 50% more calories available per person per day now than there was in 1960. Just because our food supply has improved, and we've had improvements in agricultural technology and a better, more efficient food system, which gets more food to more people. And that seems to be the root cause for most increases in BMI over the past sort of 20, 30 years.
I'd say I didn't know that before I read the book, and it's a very good point. I hadn't really thought that it being just gradually increasing, especially for such a long time. Or maybe I would have expected since the Second World War or something, but for well over 100 years, it's very interesting. But shouldn't that then level off at some point, right? I mean, once everybody's got enough to eat, shouldn't we see obesity rates kind of peaking?
I suppose so. I mean, I'm trying to think about the most recent figures. I mean, I think there is evidence that it is to some extent peaking.
They're not going up anywhere near as fast as were predicted, certainly, but they are. Yeah. It seems to be tipping up on average, maybe half a point a year or so.
Yeah, and it's a very crude measure as well. You think about sort of differences in people's physical appearance over the course of the 20th century. People have more muscle. People have, BMI is such a crude method of sort of seeing how much fat people have on their body, and actually an even cruder method of assessing how healthy they are, really. I think sometimes when you see the BMI increasing, that may not entirely be, a terrible thing, and often it's quite a good thing, for many people. These cutoffs are really odd. The 25 for overweight and the 30 for obese are really odd statistics, because when you look at the way we measure it, it's like the equivalent of saying measuring our education system by how many people with really high IQs, with how many geniuses there are. That's what we're going to use as our measurement of our education system, because we're just looking at sort of one extreme and a number of people crossing a certain threshold of BMI, which is a really odd thing to do. And if you look at the sort of mortality figures associated with people with different BMIs, the standard, what's considered a normal weight, 20 to 25, is generally not, especially as you get older, that's not associated with the best health outcomes. A slightly heavier weight is associated with better health outcomes. So BMIs of 20, 26, 27, that's the lowest point for mortality for a lot of ages certainly over 50. And it seems to be we seem to be basing it on an aesthetic, really, of what people look like, rather than actually evidence of whether people are healthy or not. That sort of 20, 26, 27, I think is considered by some people term that pre-obese, when rather than just being overweight. Some people say it's pre-obese,
really?
Implying that you're definitely going to increase to sort of 30, 35.
This is like pre-diabetes, is it?
Yeah.
Another way of increasing the figures.
Yeah.
So in the book, you look at various sort of proposed causes of the rise in, let's call it BMI for the sake of argument, but people getting heavier. And you go through them one by one, and you basically say, yeah, there's probably something in this, but it's not the whole answer. And even if you take them all together, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a few years since I read the book. By the end of it, there isn't a smoking gun. You think genetics is probably the biggest part. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. It's funny, actually, because that's the thing I'm most criticized for, because there's a huge amount of evidence out there that body weight, BMI, is an extremely heritable characteristic, one of the most heritable characteristics ever studied, up there with height. And that from twin studies. You study twins, identical twins and non-identical twins, and you look at differences in BMI for people who are in the same environment. And that evidence is there that it's a sort of 70-80% heritable characteristic, BMI. And a lot of people then sort of look at the book and they're, aha, how can you must be wrong because BMI's increased over the years and our genetics haven't increased. And I got the Guardian right up particularly sort of criticized me for that, which just explains to me that the Guardian don't understand, or that particular writer don't understand what heritability means, because it's, that doesn't mean that. It's dependent upon your environment, but it's an extreme, people in the same environment, it's an extremely heritable characteristic. So what for me, what that means is when you're in a food system where there is a large amount of food available, as much food as you can eat, and you're not experiencing regular hunger, as most of us in this country probably are today, then you reach a certain BMI, and that's largely determined by your genetics, and you can fight that temporarily. Probably one of the most most renowned endocrinologist who works on obesity, Jeffrey Freeman, said to me this. He always starts his lectures on obesity saying, your body weight is very much like, it's controlled by the same parts of your brain which control your desire to breathe. Breathing is within your control. You can control breathing, but eventually, you can't hold your breath. You can only, eventually it's taken out of your control. And it's the same with body weight and the same with eating. You can stop eating for a significant period of time, reduce the amount of food you eat, and you will lose quite a lot of weight. But eventually, it just happens over a much longer time than breathing. Eventually, if food is available, you will eat, and you will reach the weight that your body wants you to be in terms of, and the amount of fat your body wants you to store. And that's that's diverse across populations. That BMI that you're going to achieve if food's freely available varies hugely. And there are evolutionary sort of proposed evolutionary sort of mechanisms for how that might happen. Some people might be on an island population where food supply is variable, and and they evolved to have, when food was available, to store lots of food, store lots of that energy as fat. And some people would have been on somewhere where chasing prey or running from predators was an advantage, and so they stored less of their energy as fat when food was freely available. But what I think one of the big things is that people don't like to think that over the past sort of 30, 40, 50, 60 years, the food supply has improved dramatically in terms of availability. So if you go back to the 1950s, people will show me pictures and say, look at these people in the 1950s, look how thin they were. So yeah, but lots of people were hungry every night. Lots of people didn't have enough food to eat. Lots of children went to bed hungry in that time, far more than do now. And now kind of everyone's got an adequate supply of food. Then we're reaching that sort of genetically determined weight, and then we have that spectrum, which is why some people can eat loads and not put on weight, and why some people just permanently seem to be struggling and trying struggling and dieting all the time because they're not a weight that they think they want to be. Your body doesn't know what weight you want to be, but it will get you to a certain weight, and there are very strong hormonal mechanisms which drive that, and it's very difficult to fight against them.
So what I'm hearing is that there's really not much we can do about obesity as a society, and it's probably not even worth trying.
I think, people talk about what can we do about obesity, and for me, the best thing to do about obesity is try and is actually forget about it and focus more on people being healthier, because we seem to be focused on this one thing which is correlated to certain health outcomes, but we don't focus on people's health, and encouraging people to engage in behaviors which will improve their health. Regular exercise, stopping smoking, less drinking. Encouraging people towards those behaviors which we know will improve their health. Even if you're a higher weight, and this focus on obesity causes a lot of problems for a number of reasons. But one of the main ones, I think, is this sort of issue we have around exercise, because people like to do exercise, but they seem to focus on the weight loss aspect. And exercise is not actually a very good way of losing weight. It's a great way of improving your health, but it's not a great way of losing weight. And often people will start exercising, and they won't, because they're not losing weight, because your body doesn't want you to lose weight, essentially, and you end up eating more and you burn fewer calories at rest. It will, you end up people end up going, oh, there's no point because I'm not making myself healthier. Well, you are making yourself healthier, just not making yourself thinner. And when we correlate those two things, I think we get into a very dangerous place, because people will stop doing things which might make them healthier and start doing things that will make them thinner. There's lots of really unhealthy things you can do to lose weight, loads of them, but that doesn't mean you're improving your health. There's plenty of drugs you can take which will make pounds fall off, but you don't want to be doing them. So this association, and plenty of people do, more in the US with sort of various drugs off prescription, which actually really some of these drugs are really harmful, basically amphetamines, and that in part drives some of the correlation between heart disease and obesity, because a lot of overweight people in the US certainly are taking basically off-label amphetamines in order to lose weight.
I didn't know they were still doing that in America. Do we still do that here?
I think it's very rarely prescribed here. I think there are parts of Europe where it is.
Wow. Did you read the Dimbleby's National Food Strategy?
Yes.
What did you make of it?
The stuff on agriculture, I think was broadly in line with what I believe in, and broadly sensible. I think there's a Henry and I do disagree on things on obesity, I think the good thing about him is he does sort of invite people to occasionally to challenge him, I think there's a sort of desire for a simple solution to a complex problem, and that's kind of the problems that happen when you try and say this policy. There's too much of a focus on obesity for me. If it was a focus on improving people's health and measures to improve people's health, I think it would be a much better report and get to a much better place. I think we too often correlate a diet for weight loss as a diet for health, and I think the strategy is guilty of doing that on a large scale. I'd much rather we just said, let's just try and make people healthier. Let's try and improve health outcomes, whether or not people are obese.
That sort of brings us on to your most recent book, about how to feed the world. I don't know about Dimbleby. He did interview me for the first chapter of his strategy, and we had a couple of arguments after both chapters came out. I just think there's a sort of philosopher king thing about this. I just find it fairly absurd that you got this one guy who's going to set out an entire food strategy, including everything from how to lose weight to how to grow food in a sustainable way in the first place, when he doesn't really know that much about it. And he might get a few people, giving him advice, but from what I can tell on the obesity stuff, he's getting advice from the wrong people. But anyway, so give it. I haven't read your latest book. Can you give us a synopsis?
So if I go back to when I started writing the blog, actually, there was three. I was interested in food, obviously. I'm a chef, and I'm interested in the stuff we get wrong about food and the misinformation that's around about food and countering that. And I felt like the three big areas where there's a lot of misinformation around was one, health, and that was my first book, The Angry Chef. Two, obesity, so that was the second book, and the third one was sustainability. Sustainability of food and food systems, which is going to become increasingly important over the next few years, and increasing topic of debate. And then when I started writing that book, I realized that probably the big thing, the big issue for me was that we need, the environmental impact of food is a hugely significant thing, and we need to find ways of mitigating that, but we also need to think about that in the context of feeding the world. We can't sort of say we need to reduce the impact if those solutions, the environmental impact of food, if those solutions leave a lot of people, more people in the world hungry, because actually fighting hunger in the world is, in my opinion, the greatest achievement of humanity, and certainly the greatest achievement of the past 100, 150 years. The progress has been made, and actually in the past sort of 60 and past 30 years, the progress has been made around the world with providing everybody alive with an adequate supply of food, reducing the incidence of mass famine, reducing hunger and the worst sort of food poverty in the world. The progress has been extraordinary, and that is a tribute to the sort of amazing things that human beings can do, and that society.
Capitalism, Anthony, just call it what it is. Capitalism.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting point, actually. I look at a lot of different incidences of mass hunger, and certainly, in the 20th century, communism doesn't have a great record of feeding people, and I think it's important to sort of to understand that. I'm not, as my politics are certainly on the left, but in terms of food systems, feeding people, those sorts of the central control of a food system just seems to be a route to disaster. And a lot of when I sort of look at sort of food policy, I always think it's so important to remember that food is the worst thing to try and centrally control. As the people of China and the Ukraine and various places around the world which have been lived under a centrally controlled food system will attest. And it's the failure of communism, perhaps more than anything, is the failure of it to manage a food system, and the queues, people queuing up to buy food. There's Hans Rosling said, when people are hungry, they can't use their energies for anything other than finding food. You can't progress society when a society is hungry, and so.
Which is partly the reason communist dictators have used hunger quite deliberately.
Certainly, there's certainly evidence of that. If you look at sort of the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s, it was very much starving a population out of existence. A combination of incompetence and sort of and evil, I think. But those two things often go together. So. Yes, central control of the food system does always concern me. And actually, when we were getting into the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, there were a lot of people, I think, who really wanted not wanted, that's probably a bit strong, but felt they would have been proved right if the food system had failed completely. Because when the food system does fail completely, that's the breakdown of society within days. It's an incredibly serious thing. So a lot of people do worry about the fragility of the food system and the just-in-time system, but a lot of supermarkets work by. And people were calling for a central control of the food system at that point. And I think you just need to look through history a bit to understand how dangerous that is and what a dangerous area that is to get into. No society, I don't think, has ever really succeeded in having properly centrally controlled food system without mass hunger, without essentially sort of enormous famines at some point, and generally speaking, with large food shortages, where the best and brightest and most intelligent people in your society spend 90% of their time trying to find sources of food and trying to feed their family. That's you never progress society. The classic story is when the Iron Curtain was coming down, there was a Soviet delegation to London who were driving around London to sort of learn a bit about how they were going to sort of transfer to a market economy. And the guy in the car turned to one of the economists who was taking them around and said, I want to speak to the guy who's in charge of the supply of bread to London, because he was amazed how we had all this bread on the shelves all the time and people were allowed to buy it. And he had to dare to explain to him, well, look, no one's in charge. It's an emergent system. It just kind of happens, and we're not really quite sure why or how, but and that seems to be, for all its sort of unpredictability and for all its the uncertainty it creates and the uneasiness actually it creates in our mind, that seems to be over history the best way of keeping people fed.
Indeed. The invisible hand. We're out of time already. Honestly, I could have talked for twice as long at least, but thanks very much for coming on the show. Thank you very much for watching. Do get Anthony's books. They're all fantastic. I haven't read the third one, but I'm sure it's fantastic. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks for watching. Thanks if you donate to the IA. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you especially for that. If you want to become one, go to ia.org.uk/donate, or go to our Patreon if you want to fund our digital output like this specifically. I still can't remember what the Patreon website is, maybe patreon.com/IA, possibly, if that's the International Energy Agency. Don't give the money. If it's the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, definitely don't give the money. If it's the IA, do. I will try and remember what the Patreon address is for next week or next fortnight. Until then, thank you very much. I'm Chris Snowdon. Goodbye.